The Monster Hunter movie was released in the USA and China in December 2020 and worldwide in 2021. It was written and directed by Paul W.S. Anderson and had been in the works as early as 2009. Anderson has a long history with video game adaptations, beginning with Mortal Kombat, and today is largely known for his work on adapting Capcom's Resident Evil games into movies. Today, we're going to discuss every aspect of Paul W.S. Anderson's Monster Hunter, the writer and director, production, critical reception, and overall relations of the games. Most of all, we'll really discuss what the movie did well, but also why it ended up with the reputation it has. Paul Anderson is a movie writer and director from the United Kingdom. He had some experience in TV, but in 1994 he released his first movie, titled Shopping. It's an interesting title that refers to what delinquent youth in the 80s and 90s would call breaking into and robbing shops, usually by stealing a car and ramming it through the window. The movie features Jude Law in his first major leading role, along with Sadie Frost, who Anderson credits for getting the movie funded since she was a proven star. It even features actors such as Sean Bean. It's one of those movies that doesn't really have much of a story, but is very good at capturing a specific vibe, that being the streets of Britain in the 80s and 90s. Anderson teamed up with producer Jeremy Boltz for this movie, a partnership that would go on to span many movies, including the ones we'll eventually get to. Anderson himself grew up in Newcastle, and it's likely he personally heard about a lot of the kinds of crimes seen in this movie. Part of why he made Shopping to begin with was because he felt that most British movies tended to be boring period dramas that didn't really appeal to the youth. In an interview with Greg King in 1995, he said something along these lines. Indeed, Anderson grew up watching mostly American movies. Shopping portrays a very bleak society. Jude Law's character Billy has no prospects, and the moment he gets out of jail, he jacks a car and narrowly avoids the police in a chase. He goes on to rob several more cars and stores throughout the movie and is labelled by his fellow teens as an adrenaline junkie. There's a scene where he stands in the middle of a motorway as cars rush past him, just for the thrill of it, while his friend begs him to stop being so stupid. Despite being almost 20, if not over, he insists on robbing higher and higher profile stores, not for monetary gain, but for the respect of his peers, many of whom are much younger than him. The closest thing Shopping has to an antagonist, on the other hand, robs these stores as a business and is angry when Billy hits one of his targets. While I did watch Shopping for this video, it's hard to find first-hand information about it. Box office figures are non-existent, nor can I really find reviews from that time. Based on second-hand sources, what we do know is that its budget was tiny, around $2 million USD. The rule of thumb with movie finances is that they need to make back roughly 2.5 times their budget to be successful. Shopping was said to be a fairly decent success despite being obscure, likely because its budget was extremely conservative. That being said, it was also kind of panned by UK critics. UK censors in particular were not happy with the kind of things it portrayed, and delayed its theatrical release for months. When it did finally arrive, many cinemas outright banned it. Shopping didn't even get a theatrical release in the USA either. Mind you, this was a couple years before Trainspotting, a similar styled movie that also has themes of UK-based teenage delinquency, released and became a fairly beloved classic. In some ways, it could be argued that Shopping paved the way for it. There's also a case to be made that, like its central protagonist, the movie itself was fairly rebellious. It wasn't just inspired by the kind of things Anderson saw growing up, but both he and Jeremy Boltz also believe it to be a reaction to the stale British film industry. Now that being said, scarce reviews of Shopping from later years are kind of lukewarm on the movie. While it's said that Shopping was a controversial movie for its era, perhaps there were other factors as to why its legacy has been rather small. That being said, while I agree with what the reviewer said about Shopping's message being rather basic, I still feel like it's rather effective. Again, Billy is visibly older than his peers, but just doesn't see a future for himself outside of Shopping despite closer and closer calls with the police and even rival gang members. Sadie Frost's character at one point cleans herself up and decides to move on because even she reckons there's more to life, before being convinced to do one last job with Billy. This goes about as well as you'd expect for them. There's a genuine message here that the youth didn't have much to live for and actively dragged each other down, while society at large was unable or even just unwilling to help them. It's a bleak movie with a very interesting visual style. The success of Shopping on its rather limited budget paved the way for a new opportunity for Anderson. Producer Lawrence Kasanoff became interested in adapting the video game onto the big screen after playing it on arcades. It took him some time to convince the heads of the studio behind the games though, because of flops like the infamous Super Mario Bros. Movie, but after 3 months they relented. Kasanoff offered the director role to Anderson because of Shopping. He was impressed by the movie's visual flair, but also the talent he managed to have featured there, all on such a tiny budget. Anderson had also played Mortal Kombat in arcades before, so he was down for the job. The real challenge for him this time was visual effects. Impressively, Shopping was all practical, but this meant he had no idea how to do visual effects. He therefore read up on every book he could find in preparation. The budget allocated for these effects was more than what Shopping required in its entirety, and while they're quite dated, they're not terrible. This character called Goro was operated with a $1 million animatronic, and it is really impressive. I rather enjoyed Shopping, and despite taking some time to click with me, Mortal Kombat was a good time as well. I have little to no attachment to the games, having never played them, but as I went, I found myself enjoying how well made it is. I like the fight scenes. There's lots of cool moves and less cuts than you'd expect, letting the action speak for itself. Sometimes they're filmed from a wide angle to resemble a real fighting game. The music is great too. Some of it is lifted straight from the games, and in general it's very funky. Mortal Kombat was a giant success, earning $120 million on a mere $20 million budget, making it one of the most successful video games ever at the time. Critics kind of shredded it though. Many of them praised the visuals, but the acting and story were criticised for being rather dull. While some noted that only fans of the video game would really enjoy it, others contested even that. Roger Ebert, for example, pointed out that the movie was far less violent and bloody than the games had been infamous for, which might be disappointing for fans.
Mortal Kombat game, which you know has been very controversial because of its level of violence, we're kind of disappointed that the killings in the movie weren't nearly as sensational as the ones in the game, where people have unbelievably horrible things happen to them.
I'm terribly sorry for those children.
You would have been amazed since you felt the movie was too violent.
The movie, I thought it was fun. You had a better time, admit it, you had a better time than you thought you were going to have in this picture.
Well, since I thought I was going to have a very bad time, that would be true almost no matter what I thought.
But by and large, the fans and general audiences did like the movie, and it's still fondly remembered today. The fight scenes are really good. The set design is fantastic, and people did enjoy seeing their favourite characters duking it out in live action. Early in the movie, the character Reptile is present as a freaky CGI lizard, which isn't at all how he is in the games. He shows up again later, and is able to take on a human form and fight Liu Kang. This was not featured at all in previews or marketing, which made for a very hyped twist for the fans. And to this day, people are especially fond of Kari Hiroyuki Tagawa as Shang Tsung, and future portrayals of the character are often compared to his performance. In simple terms, while Shopping did okay, and is rather obscure to this day, Anderson's efforts on the first Mortal Kombat resulted in one of the first ever successful video game movies, delivered at an impressively low budget. It really puts Anderson on the map, and what's more, is that the sequel for Mortal Kombat was done without him, and drastically underperformed. Perhaps he was a key ingredient. Anderson did not write his next movies, only directed them, and this time they did not go so well. His horror film Event Horizon wasn't just blasted by critics, it didn't even break even at the box office. His next movie, Soldier, suffered a similar fate. Both ended up being cult classics and are looked back on somewhat favourably today. Every time I've seen these movies discussed online, it's pretty much always in a positive manner. When you consider how both Shopping and Mortal Kombat were also disliked by critics but loved by audiences, you may realise that this is a very common theme in Anderson's filmography. Critics, whether they be for movies, video games, or even things like food, have higher standards than the general audience. Most of the time, the audience just wants to be entertained for a few hours, while critics want to actually judge a movie, and whether it's really worth experiencing. They won't just tell you if something is good or bad, they'll usually be able to explain why in detail, the things it does well or poorly, how it could have been done better. They're usually well versed in the thing they're reviewing, which makes them better at pointing out quality or mediocrity. Having these standards and judging things by them is a good thing. Movies that are good should be praised for the things they do well, and movies that are bad should be criticised directly for the things they do poorly or fail to achieve. It's also imperative that the audience should be informed whether or not they're going to waste money and multiple hours of their life on a movie. Now, there's plenty of amateurish criticism out there, especially today, and even the real professional critics can often be overly harsh sometimes towards movies that age really well in the long run. When you think about Mortal Kombat or many of Anderson's later movies, you can see exactly the kind of problems critics would have with them, and they're valid complaints. But that doesn't stop them from being decent fun for the average person. It's not a bad thing at all to have lower standards. I, for one, am not really a movie critic. When I watched Mortal Kombat, my only concern was, Am I enjoying this? And the answer ended up being yes. It's always possible for a movie to review badly, despite being good enough for the average person. Anderson has been described as a populist filmmaker in that he makes movies for the audience, not the critics. He's not looking to receive high praise, but to entertain regular people who have bought a ticket to see one of his movies. This stems back to him viewing Total Recall on opening day in New York City among an American audience, and seeing them screaming and cheering at crazy moments in the movie, which was a totally alien experience for him, having grown up in the UK. The movie-going experience here is quite subdued and people tend to behave themselves. So Total Recall showed Anderson a whole new angle to cinema that he wasn't aware of. Who knew that a movie could rile up an audience like this? He wants his movies to do that to regular people, not gain validation from some snobs in the papers. The critical reception for Shopping also factored into his populist approach. It is said that critics tore it apart, unfairly in Anderson's opinion, considering its fairly small budget and the somewhat asinine nature of the things they disliked, such as Jude Law apparently being too handsome. But it, and most of Anderson's other early movies, became appreciated later by regular people, so appealing to them from the get-go seemed like the best approach. Resident Evil is a series of video games in the survival horror genre developed by Capcom that began in 1996 and is still going to this day. Early talks for a movie began in 1997, where a production company known as Constantin Film acquired the rights for a live-action adaptation of the games. Constantin was quite a small company, and producer Bernd Eichinger wanted to beat out fierce competition from other Hollywood studios. He did this by really appealing to Capcom, flying over and visiting them in Japan, and showing them that not only did he really understand the Resident Evil games, but that he and his company would consult with them on a regular basis. Their first attempt at a movie didn't get very far, as Adam B. McElroy was hired to write a script which ended up being rejected, as it was based too much on the first game. Since the movie would be releasing around the time of the second game, the producers felt it would have been too dated. The second attempt went a bit further, as George A. Romero was asked to write and direct a potential Resident Evil movie. The director of the first game, Shinji Mikami, was inspired by Romero's movies when making the games, so in theory this could have worked really well. Romero's script featured many characters and villains from the games, and would have been a direct adaptation from the first one. However, Romero ended up writing 5 or 6 different drafts that all ended up being rejected, because the producers felt that despite being good, they would have netted the movie an NC-17 rating, which restricts anyone under the age of 18 from seeing it in theatres. Ultimately, it didn't end up going anywhere. Enter Paul Anderson. At this point, he'd been going by Paul W.S. Anderson, to differentiate himself from American director Paul Thomas Anderson. Our Anderson reportedly played the first 3 Resident Evil games and completely disappeared from public life for 2 weeks. He was actually a huge fan of George Romero's movies, and felt that since Resident Evil games were inspired from them, he could essentially take the games and turn them back into a movie. Anderson then wrote a script for a movie called Undead, which was essentially a fake, not Resident Evil story that could in theory be a prequel to the first game. Jeremy Bolt attempted to buy the rights from Capcom, only to discover Constantin Film already had them. As luck would have it, Anderson and Bolt had been in talks with Constantin Film for other movies, so this worked out quite nicely. At this point, the movie wasn't going anywhere, and the company was even considering letting the rights go. Anderson showed them Undead. The pitch was that if they liked it, they would change it to Resident Evil. If not, he would make an original standalone movie, and well, the rest is history. Resident Evil begins in an underground facility owned by the Umbrella Corporation. A man is seen stealing a mysterious liquid and shattering another, before leaving the room. It then cuts to other people working in the facility, scientists and office workers going about their day. Suddenly, the facility starts shutting down bit by bit, automatically killing everyone inside. The movie then switches to our protagonist, Alice, portrayed by Mila Jovovich. Alice wakes up in a mansion with no memory of who she is, let alone what she was doing there. After getting a look at her surroundings, things suddenly escalate, as a man she doesn't know grabs her before several armed soldiers burst in through the windows. The leader explains that every person there is an employee of the Umbrella Corporation, and that the mansion is a secret entrance to that huge facility we saw in the movie's opening, an underground research base called the Hive. Something happened there, and it launched a defensive mechanism, amnesia gas, that made Alice forget everything. Their job is to figure out why it shut down. They turn off power to the facility, and to their utter horror, get ambushed by a horde of zombies that are very clearly what remains of the staff that worked there, thanks to a virus that was being worked on. They now have to escape the Hive while evading all sorts of undead creatures, find a cure, and hopefully stop the outbreak from spreading further. As mentioned earlier, the movie serves as a prequel to the games, and so we know their efforts were kind of unsuccessful. As such, The movie ends with Alice escaping, but being taken to an umbrella facility for experimentation. She manages to break out an unknown amount of time later, only to discover empty, destroyed streets, as it becomes apparent that the zombie outbreak has spread. Because Anderson wrote Undead so that it could potentially be a standalone movie completely unrelated to Resident Evil, no Resident Evil characters from the games appear here. For the record, I have little to no history with Resident Evil as a franchise. I own a couple of the games and in typical gamer fashion have not played them, except for a bit of the second game's remake. But I did see the first movie so I could talk about it for this video, and funnily enough, not playing the games has given me an interesting perspective. Anderson's job was to make a movie that not just Resident Evil fans would enjoy, but also casual moviegoers who had no experience with the games. That's me, I'm that guy. And I enjoyed the movie. I don't normally do well with horror, and I really hate blood, but I had a great time here. Seeing the mystery of the zombie outbreak and the hive unfold was really fun, as well as all the crazy defenses the facility had, like the laser hallway. That was wild. Again, no pre-existing Resident Evil characters are in this movie. They're all originals. I only know a few names like Leon Kennedy or Claire Redfield. But either way, I didn't know who in this movie would die and who would live, which made the whole thing quite tense and led to a lot of twists and turns. The protagonist, Alice, has amnesia that she never fully recovers from even at the end of the movie. This lets her serve as an audience stand-in, or surrogate, someone who doesn't know what's going on in this story, which allows the characters to explain key aspects about the world to her, namely the Umbrella Corporation and functions of the Hive. She remembers more and more about herself and what her original goals were as the movie goes on, and the same goes for other characters with amnesia. I had to rewatch some scenes for the video script, and it made me want to rewatch the whole thing because there's a lot of neat foreshadowing and hints as to what's really going on that you might have missed earlier. Funnily enough, I've heard the Resident Evil games are very replayable too, so that's a neat parallel. Resident Evil released in March 2002 and financially was a huge success, grossing $103 million worldwide on a $33 million budget, almost as good as Mortal Kombat 7 years earlier, which only had a budget of $20 million. That's another trend in Anderson's filmography. He is very good at making decent movies on a smaller budget. This means they can make huge returns at the box office, and if they bomb, then it's not a huge loss. It's not easy to make a good looking movie with limited money, but it's something Anderson proved himself to be rather skilled at, and this factors into why he was able to find consistent work despite his movies not being critical darlings. Speaking of critics, in typical Anderson fashion they hated it. It's boring, it's not scary enough, it's yet more proof video game movies don't work. Audiences once again were more favourable, and to this day I would say Resident Evil fans are quite positive towards the first movie. I say the first because it got 5 more sequels, all of them with conservative budgets, yet each more successful than the last. Unlike Mortal Kombat, Anderson stayed involved with the sequels. All of them were written by him, with 2 and 3 being directed by Alexander Witt and Russell Mulcahy, and movies 4 to 6 directed by Anderson again. The movies have left a very important legacy for Anderson, as they've collectively grossed $1.2 billion, making Resident Evil the most successful video game to movie franchise for a very long time. He first met Milla Jovovich when filming the first movie, which led to the two getting married, and they're still together to this day. Capcom were also pleased by how well the movies had done, and they had a very positive working relationship with Anderson and Bolts. Truth is, the duo had full creative control on the movies. Sure, Capcom were allowed to consult and make suggestions, but Anderson and Bolts could have done whatever they wanted. Despite that, they made sure to fly over to Japan regularly, and Anderson would explain his vision of the movies to Capcom directly. He and Bolts earned their respect and trust, and every successful Resident Evil movie caused a significant spike in sales for the games. Capcom's only real priority was not to tarnish the brand. In fact, I myself kind of want to play them now. I have the remake of the first game on Steam, and I know it takes place in a mansion. Having seen the first movie, I do want to see how that plays out. Now, all this being said, while the first Resident Evil movie is looked back upon fondly, it's largely believed that the later ones jumped the shark, so to speak, and are just really bad. Nowadays, when you see people talk about Anderson, it's usually negative, and Resident Evil is always brought up. I was hesitant to watch the second and third movies for this video, because they were not directed by Anderson, but he did write them. So to try and understand the discourse better, I decided to watch them, although I did go in with an open mind, not knowing exactly why fans hated them so much. Resident Evil Apocalypse is a decent time. It's cool seeing Raccoon City as it descends into zombie hell, and the direct consequences of the first movie. Alice returns, but this time you have a new cast of characters, including Jill Valentine, who I know is from the games. During the movie, Alice is shown to be a lot better than Jill. Better at fighting, shooting, smarter. The movie makes a point of this quite a few times. I immediately guessed that this was something fans hated about the movie, and I was right. I personally was not that fussed though, because, you know, at this point I have more attachment to Alice as a character, but I could see why people would be upset, as if Anderson is favouring his OC. At the end of Apocalypse, Alice gains psionic powers, and this continues into Extinction, where she uses these powers to fight the several tough enemies. Claire Redfield is also there. I knew from general discourse that the later Resident Evil movies quote-unquote got worse, and now I can kind of see how. Anderson did direct movies 4 to 6, and I can only imagine how weird they get, as they delve into lore that you probably would not see in the games. Earlier I talked about Anderson's popular strategy for making movies, appealing to the fans and the general audience rather than the critics. It has its strengths in that audiences are much easier to please, but it can backfire because audiences are also much easier to upset. Anderson had witnessed this firsthand, as test screenings for Event Horizon scored low due to its unfinished CGI and downer ending, which caused the movie to get slashed up in the edits by the studio, and ended up compromising the movie on a creative level. Critics are good at pointing out issues with movies that might not occur or even matter to the average moviegoer, but it doesn't take much to give that crowd a bad feeling and make them think less of the movie. Yes, the Resident Evil movies were financial successes, but they did decline in the USA over time, and it was the worldwide box office sales that largely made their money. The final chapter in particular did very well in China. The first half of Anderson's filmography is a collection of well-liked cult classics and Mortal Kombat. But much of the negative opinions you see about him today stem from the Resident Evil movies. At this point, we have a pretty clear picture of Paul W.S. Anderson. He made his start with shopping, which led to him being hired for Mortal Kombat, which ended up being a major success. After a string of flops, he managed to make a $1 billion movie franchise out of Resident Evil. His movies were constantly scorned by critics, but viewed positively by the general audience. Because he can make these movies on the cheap, the flops are well insulated from losing too much money, and his successes are far more profitable than they would have been otherwise. It's also worth remembering that his IP-driven films tend to do much better than his original ones. Anderson had a working relationship with Capcom established. Not just that, he was one of the few writers and directors at the time with a proven track record making successful video game movie adaptations. And this set the stage for him to try his hand at a Monster Hunter movie. In the year 2012, Monster Hunter was in an interesting spot. 3 Ultimate had been released for the Wii U and 3DS, and the next generation of games was on the horizon. At this point, Monster Hunter was a fairly popular, albeit niche franchise. It was quite big in Japan, especially on handheld devices, but hadn't quite broken out in the West just yet. Paul W.S. Anderson first experienced Monster Hunter in 2008 and became enamoured with the series, wanting to bring it to the movie similar to what he had done with Resident Evil. He loved the different monsters and environments seen in the games, and began talks with Capcom for a real movie adaptation as early as 2009. At this point, he and Jeremy Bolt had written, directed, and produced 3 highly successful Resident Evil movies. Capcom accepted, and in 2012, Anderson soft announced he was planning to make Monster Hunter into a film. Like Mortal Kombat and Resident Evil, Constantine Film would be backing it once again. Shortly before the release of Resident Evil The Final Chapter, the Monster Hunter movie was officially announced by Ryozo Tsujimoto at Tokyo Game Show in 2016. Anderson and Boltz gave an interview with Deadline, where they thoroughly discussed how it came about. Turns out, it's a simple matter. Capcom wholeheartedly trusted the duo with Monster Hunter after what they had done with Resident Evil. If you recall, they made a $1 billion movie franchise out of it, and massively elevated the game's profile and sales, all while regularly consulting with Capcom and listening to them when they never really had to. Why wouldn't Capcom work with these guys again? Around the time he initially announced the movie, Anderson's idea for a Monster Hunter adaptation centered around a bullied, quite clumsy 16-year-old boy named Lucas, who lived an ordinary life on Earth, our world. One day, characters from the Monster Hunter world would come searching for him, as he was the chosen one, needed to defeat a monster that was threatening to cross over to Earth. This would have tied in with a lot of Earth's myths, like dragons or minotaurs, with the idea being that they were real monsters that heroes had once repelled. The lore of this movie would dictate that, one day, they disappeared into the Monster Hunter world, but now they were coming back, and a hero was needed to repel them, before they destroyed our world. 2 worlds, 2 dimensions, 2 realities. This aspect did make it into the final movie, and it's clear Anderson had it in mind from the beginning. What changed was the choice in protagonist. A couple of times actually. Lucas was conceptualized while the later Harry Potters and the first 2 Percy Jackson movies were out. Twilight was big. The early 2010s were a massive time for young adult fiction on the big screen. Lucas slotted in quite well, and would be an interesting change of pace compared to Resident Evil's action heroine Alice. However, after finalizing their deal for Monster Hunter, Anderson and Bolt focused first on completing the second Resident Evil trilogy, which demanded more of their time as they did not rely on a different director. By 2016, Lucas was found dead in Miami. Anderson and Bolt had come back to Monster Hunter to discover that audiences didn't really care about young adults anymore. Those days were over. So, Anderson switched gears slightly, and when describing the movie to Deadline later, he instead talked about the central character being an ordinary person with a dead-end job, who has no prospects, future. He describes how this man would be dragged into the Monster Hunter world, and that eventually, the movie would end up back in our world with the monsters invading, with a big final battle in Los Angeles airports. The idea of having a regular male working man be the protagonist was dropped by 2018, for reasons unknown. Instead, Anderson went back to familiar territory, a female protagonist portrayed by none other than Milla Jovovich. Shortly later, Ron Perlman and Tony Jaa were cast as well. Anderson has a bit of a reputation for casting his wife, Milla Jovovich, in many of his movies. They got married around the time of Resident Evil 4, and she's only been absent from Alien vs Predator, Death Race and Pompeii, but she has been in almost everything else. Some poke fun at the two for it, but others actually criticise them, calling Jovovich a nepotism hire, or claiming that Anderson only makes these movies so his wife has a job. I personally don't think that's the case. Milla Jovovich's filmography is massive, and only a small fraction of those had Anderson involved. As for why he casts her in so much, it's not that complicated. Directors love to hire actors that they trust and know how to work with. Jordan Peele has Daniel Kaluuya, Tarantino has Samuel L. Jackson, and Martin Scorsese has Leonardo DiCaprio. Not to compare Anderson to those directors, but it's not really a mystery why he keeps hiring Jovovich. They trust each other, and she's described their movies as family bonding events. I think for me, it would be an issue if she was a bad actress, but she isn't. I touched upon this earlier, but I do think a lot of the hate comes down to how massive of a part Jovovich's Alice plays in the Resident Evil movies. She's more prominent than several established characters from the games, and because she's married to the writer and director, it led to the impression that Anderson is doing favouritism, which, he might well be. Back to Monster Hunter. Part of what excited Anderson about this movie is that he would get to shoot on location for most of it. The Resident Evil movies tended to use a lot of green screen and sound stages. Monster Hunter would be a very different change of pace, and Anderson believed shooting in real landscapes would be the best way to do the game's justice. The movie was shot from October to December 2018, around Cape Town, South Africa, and it required the entire crew of 350 to live in a tent village. The temperatures would range from really hot to freezing cold, as deserts are. Like Alice in Resident Evil, Milla Jovovich's character would once again be an audience surrogate, someone who didn't know anything about the world she was entering, journeying with the audience and learning along the way. It worked for Resident Evil, and hopefully would do the same for Monster Hunter. Now, you might be wondering, how did people feel about the movie at this point? News of it had undoubtedly spread, and many were well aware that a large-scale Hollywood production would be happening soon, directed by the visionary behind hits such as Resident Evil and Mortal Kombat. Well, they were less than thrilled, and like I said, it's largely down to the Resident Evil movies. If you recall, the first movie is well liked, but the later ones are not. Yes, they made money, but it's safe to say most consider them to be dumb fun, and the ones who took them seriously were left feeling annoyed or angry. And so, despite Resident Evil being a billion-dollar movie franchise, Anderson sort of has this franchise ruiner reputation following him around. Even before people knew he was involved, they were not very optimistic, but afterwards, there was fury. What really set people off was the idea that a normal person would somehow be transported into the Monster Hunter world. This trope is quite common in different types of fiction, and Japanese people refer to it as isekai, which is what I'll use too. Isekais are useful narrative tools because, thinking back to earlier, they let the protagonist act as an audience surrogate. The audience will be witnessing this unfamiliar world, but so will the protagonist, and they'll kind of learn with us. However, isekai gets criticised a lot. For one, the genre, particularly with video game movies, is largely paid out. The first Super Mario Bros. Movie was an isekai, for instance. It does get old for people. For others though, adaptations of video games that are isekais also feel like a complete betrayal of confidence in the game setting. A story like the Chronicles of Narnia, where children living through World War II get transported to this fantasy world is fine, because the story at its inception is an isekai. But Monster Hunter is not. We don't get shoved through a portal when we start up the games. Instead, we're already living in the world in some way, shape or form. Maybe we have to pass a few tests, but then we're good to go, we're on our way. It should not be difficult to do that again for the big screen. People despise the idea of Anderson's Lucas draft already, the idea of chosen heroes and mythology being incorporated, and so it's definitely good that that aspect was cut. So it's safe to say that people were not positive about the movie at all, and this got worse when previews were released. Here is actor Diego Boneta sharing a still from the movie. He's in full military gear, wielding a very real modern looking gun. Not at all the kind of thing you'd expect in Monster Hunter, and T.I. Harris posting a picture of the whole crew in military gear more or less confirmed that the people who'd be travelling from our world into Monster Hunter would be the military. People were very, very angry about this. We want a Monster Hunter movie about real hunters, not US Army soldiers, and it led to Mila Jovovich posting a selfie on her social media in her character's costume. She acknowledged how upset people were, and wanted to assure people that no, this would be a real Monster Hunter movie. As you can see, she's wearing the slinger from Monster Hunter World on her arm, so things wouldn't exactly be what we'd come to expect. The first trailer did them no favours though. Released in October 2020, it depicts soldiers investigating their missing team before being caught up in a literal sandstorm. They find themselves in a new unfamiliar land and get attacked by Black Diablos. In the trailer we see Tony Jaa as a hunter, Nursilla, a brief glimpse of Gore Magala, lots of different action shots, and of course Rathalos tearing a plane out of the sky. So this led to a mixed reception. On one hand, the monsters look great. Black Diablo sounds exactly like herself, and moved around like how she does in the games, and the brief glimpses of Gore Magala and Rathalos look pretty good too. We even saw Mila Jovovich wielding dual swords. On the other hand, the military featured heavily, aiming their guns everywhere, saying stupid lines nobody liked.
What? Are we like Guardians of the Galaxy now?
They dragged it all down. Then the movie finally released, and like most of Anderson's movies, critics were not kind to it. But unlike Mortal Kombat and all 6 Resident Evils, Monster Hunter was a box office bomb, grossing $40 million on a $60 million budget. The movie begins with a brief explanation that there's other worlds beyond what we can see, and we then cut to the new world as seen in Monster Hunter World, with a sand ship sailing along a desert. Characters we saw in Monster Hunter World are present here. Ron Perlman is the Admiral, Tony Jaa is the field team leader, with a handler, Leah and Aiden nearby. Suddenly the ship is attacked by Black Diablos, who heavily damages it and knocks Tony Jaa, aka the Hunter, overboard. The ship sails away without him, as he begins to wake up. We then cut to our world. Natalie Artemis, portrayed by Mila Jovovich, is a ranger in the United Nations military, leading a unit seeking out a different lost unit, known as Bravo Team. Marshall, played by Diego Boneta, tells her they found something, and so the rest of her crew sets off. Link, played by T.I., Dash by Megan Good, Steeler by Josh Hellman, and Axe by Jin Oh Young. They set off to the missing crew's last known location, only to encounter a sandstorm that quickly overwhelms them. The sandstorm has lightning coursing through it, and it lifts their vehicle up and tosses them around. The team wakes up in an unfamiliar desert, with a mysterious tower in the distance, their GPS and compass broken, leaving them with no tools to figure out where to go. They soon discover the remains of Bravo Team, completely torched by flames to such an extent that the sand near them was turned to glass. They decide to set off in the direction of the sun, in the hopes of making radio contact with their headquarters. After singing an army song for a solid 90 seconds, they encounter giant bones in the middle of the desert. Suddenly, the hunter sees them and shoots an arrow at the bone above them. The crew mistakes him as a hostile for a moment and fires upon him, only to realise he was actually warning them. Black Diablos was approaching, and after a few moments of shock terror, they drive away as fast as they can, firing at her, but their bullets seemingly have no effect. They try to escape, but Black Diablos catches up and flips one of their vehicles. She manages to kill Steeler and Axe, but the crew are finally able to escape into a cave. After panicking about their situation for a moment, and finally realising that they're no longer in their own world, things get much worse, as Artemis is scooped up and stung by a Nursilla, which seemingly kills her. The crew tries to revive her to no avail, and eventually have to run because a horde of Nursilla of many different sizes are fast approaching. Despite the hunter trying to help from a distance, the Nasilla are able to surround the crew and manage to kill Marshall after biting his head off. We cut back to Artemis, who is webbed up but finally coming to her senses. She breaks free, only to discover Dash was webbed up too and she was killed. After slowly moving, she encounters Link, the last surviving member of her team who is seemingly injured. They try to move but Link is in too much pain, so Artemis checks his injuries, only to find that the Nasilla have laid a ton of eggs into him that are hatching and consuming him alive. Link dies as Artemis finally is able to escape the cave they're in at the cost of an injured leg. The Nasilla appear to hate the sunlight and therefore do not follow her out, so she is safe, for now. Artemis begins walking and finds a shipwreck that someone has clearly been living in, before being ambushed by the hunter. The two fights for a while before he knocks her out. Artemis speaks English while the hunter speaks a different language, and as such they cannot understand each other. She ends up his prisoner and observes him eating and praying, before eventually breaking free and taking him prisoner. Then he breaks free and they get into another fight that almost ends in him falling into the Nasilla nest. Artemis helps him out and, language barrier notwithstanding, they finally agree to work together. She pieces together that the stormy tower in the distance is the key to her getting home, but Black Diablos' territory is in the way. The hunter devises a plan: kill a Nasilla, take the stinger, use the venom to put Diablos to sleep, then get past him. They manage to kill a Nasilla by using Artemis to bait one out. He then teaches her how to wield dual swords. They set up traps and essentially prepare for the Diablos hunt. The hunt starts going well, however, the hunter's poison shot is delayed, and despite the arrow hitting Diablos square in the eye, it doesn't seem to do anything to her. She goes after Artemis, but the hunter is able to leap on top and stick a greatsword into her head. Diablos shakes him off so violently that he gets knocked out, but Artemis is able to deliver the killing blow. She carries the unconscious hunter across a desert in a stretcher made from Diablos' hide, and eventually he wakes up as they make it to an oasis, with Apsaros feasting. The two make camp, but suddenly a Rathalos appears, starts a fire, and causes the Apsaros to stampede. The duo are in a tricky spot, only for the Admiral to appear and help keep them away using his switch axe. The hunter gets driven back, but is rescued by the handler. Eventually the group succeeds, only for the Admiral to speak English to Artemis and knock her out. Artemis later wakes up in a cell on the ship. She breaks out and runs into the Meowsula chef. The hunter takes her up to the Admiral, who says he locked her away because he had reason to fear her. A long time ago, others crossed over to the Monster Hunter world, which is how the Admiral knows English. He seeks to visit that tower, which was built by an ancient civilization. The Admiral believes the tower is what creates the portals connecting the worlds, and it's possible our world destroyed that civilization. Shutting down the tower will ensure it won't happen again, but the ancient civilization used monsters to guard their creations, and to this day, a Rathalos protects their tower. They need to kill it. The Admiral points out that Rathalos is weak just before he breathes fire. They travel to the tower, and upon arriving things don't go too well. The Rathalos is massive, and a few of the hunters accompanying the group get fried. The handler, Leah and Aiden get knocked out, and to escape Rathalos' flames, Artemis is forced to jump off a cliff, and just then, a portal to her own world opens. The UN army is able to rescue her and prepare to evacuate via plane, only for Rathalos to arrive and begin destroying the military. After they're all dead, Artemis faces off with and fatally wounds it, before the hunter arrives and deals the final blow. The Admiral shows up soon after, saying they need to shut down the tower to stop the monsters crossing over. Just then, Gore Magala shows up, and the group rushes at him. Roll credits! Later, the Meowsula chef joins the fight, and a mysterious cloaked figure is seen watching them from high up, before walking away. Roll credits! Again! As usual with Anderson, critics did not like it, although it's worth mentioning its aggregate score on Rotten Tomatoes, I'm British, on Rotten Tomatoes is higher than all his Resident Evil movies, which means that out of all critics that reviewed the movie, there were a higher ratio of positive reviews. Even the audience score is positive, which again is not the case for Resident Evil. Generally, it was blasted for being boring, empty, lifeless. Even critics that acknowledged it's more of a turn your brain off movie still thought it sucked by that metric and simply wasn't fun enough. Those that gave Monster Hunter a positive review didn't seem to love it, as the scores averaged at around 3 out of 5 stars. One reviewer highlights the reports between Tony Jaa and Mila Jovovich, which is an interesting point that we'll touch upon later. The box office failure is worth getting into, because in terms of Anderson franchise films, it's a total anomaly. All of them did well despite reviewing worse, but Monster Hunter failed to make back its budget. I would attribute the box office failure to 2 things. Firstly, this came out not too long after the worst of the COVID-19 pandemic, where people were advised to stay home and didn't really go out much in order to avoid catching the virus. A lot of industries suffered massively from this, particularly the movies. But what's interesting is that even though the pandemic kind of ended, things didn't go back to the way they were before. Moviegoers' habits had been permanently altered. They were far less likely to go out and buy a ticket to the movie. I was watching Maximilian Dude react to the Monster Hunter trailer, and at one point, he says this.
Not want to see the movie? Oh, I want to see it. Do I want to risk my life to go to a movie theater to see it? Yo, maybe not.
And that's the thing. People were okay with seeing a mediocre movie if they thought they were going to be entertained. Far fewer were willing to risk their lives. But it goes beyond that. The rise of streaming occurred during the pandemic, and some of you may even recall that entire theatrical movies were often released on streamers. Black Widow, for example. It was locked behind a paywall, but a lot of people did pay to see it in the comfort of their own homes, which, despite being an inferior experience, is far more convenient. Not to mention that movies came to streaming services generally quite fast, and there's an entire back catalogue for you to enjoy. A lot of moviegoers were essentially forced to break their habits and never really went back, and this contributed to movie theatres seeing a decline in ticket sales post-COVID. People became accustomed to just waiting for them to hit streaming. Things did recover after a while. I believe Top Gun Maverick really drew people in, for being a fantastic movie that's objectively the best on the big screen. But we also had Spider-Man No Way Home, Avatar The Way of Water, Barbenheimer and more. But those all came 2022 or later, and are much better movies than Monster Hunter, which was late 2020/early 2021, and I think it really suffered as a result. The second reason was a catastrophic failure at the Chinese box office. Movies in recent years make tons of money from Chinese audiences. There's over 1 billion people there, and they are very interested in seeing Hollywood movies, so it's imperative for studios to get their movies paying in that country's theatres. Anderson's later Resident Evil movies did very well thanks to China, so both he and Jeremy Bolt had high hopes for Monster Hunter doing well there too. The series was, and still is, quite popular over there, and Constantine Film even partnered up with a Chinese production company for distribution. However, Anderson and co messed up. In one of the earlier scenes of the movie, the soldiers are bantering, and one of them tells a joke. What kind of knees are these? Chinese, he says. I suppose it's a pun of some kind. You can hear the word knees in Chinese, and the actor who said the line, Jin Ao-young, is Chinese as well. But this caused controversy among Chinese moviegoers, because it's very similar to a racist playground chant that was often directed towards Chinese and Japanese people by English speakers. There was mass outrage on social media, Monster Hunter World was review bombed on Steam, and after a single day, the government pulled the film because why wouldn't they? People were not happy. This led to Constantine Film, Anderson, and even Jin Ao-young, the actor who said the line, issuing separate apologies. Eventually, Monster Hunter returned to movie theatres in China with the controversial scene removed, and it's not even in the version of the movie I watched. But it absolutely destroyed any kind of momentum it had. I think this was a significant factor in the movie bombing, and it's kind of shocking that nobody caught this in production. From what I've read, it was a really common horrible playground chant towards Chinese students in the 80s and 90s. When this incident happened, a lot of Westerners, even those that hated the movie, thought the outrage was a bit silly. After all, it was merely a pun, and didn't seem related to the chant at all. Even Jin Ao-young mentioned this in his apology. I'm a different kind of Asian, south not east, so it's not really up to me to decide whether this is offensive or not, because I'm not the target of such a chant. And I don't believe Anderson was intending to be racist when he wrote that line. But the way I see this from an outsider perspective, if the people of China were so offended that the outrage was big enough to get the movie pulled after a single day, then it can't really be disputed that this was bad. It should be mentioned that the subtitles for the movie were not directly translated. Instead, they had a different joke that Chinese audiences were more likely to get, because this one relied on English wordplay. But this angered them even more, because it looked like the movie was trying to cover it up. After all, the racist chant was something English speakers would say to torment East Asians. So of course, they would hear and recognise what Ao-young said, regardless of whatever the subtitles read as. Whether or not their outrage was justified isn't really up to me or a lot of you. It happened, and that scene should not have been there to begin with. Somebody should have caught it. So we've talked about the critical reception and potential reasons the movie bombed, but now I want to highlight what Monster Hunter fans thought, because the movie was thoroughly ripped to shreds by them and is still despised to this day, perhaps more than Resident Evil fans hate their movies. For example, when I said on social media that I was watching the movie, based on the responses, you would think I had announced I was going to run into traffic, like Billy from Shopping. I've compiled a list of some of the things I've seen Monster Hunter fans say they hate about the movie over the years, long before I watched it. The isekai, the military. Why is Diablos a carnivore? Rathalos is too big. That's literally nothing like Nasilla. Gore Magala is just sequel bait. There is no Monster Hunter movie. Why is Artemis using fire dual swords against a Rathalos? The military. The acting sucks. The movie is 70% desert. The CGI is awful. The military. What are you talking about? There is no Monster Hunter movie. It's just more Anderson wife fanfiction.
A Rathalos. Almost impossible to kill.
A Rathalos is not impossible to kill. What is Ron Perlman talking about? Artemis doesn't even say, "so tasty," when eating grilled meat. Why is Diablos acting like a shark? He doesn't even do that in the games. The military. Anderson is not a fan and clearly didn't play the games. You mean Legends of the Guild, right? Ron Perlman's switch axe doesn't even switch. The military! Why is he doing an SAED? That's a switch axe, not a charged blade. There is no Monster Hunter movie. A lot of Monster Hunter content creators dislike it too. Friend of the show Ocean has made a review some time ago, and in particular he criticised the CGI, saying that Black Diablos looked very rubbery. I personally thought the CGI was quite good, but he makes good points overall. At the time of the movie's release, I would watch a lot of Gaijin Hunter videos, and from what I recall, he was optimistic for the movie. He was not expecting anything great, but he kept an open mind and thought, it would be kind of bad but fun, like Anderson's other films. But he came out of that movie hating it. He thought the characters were unlikable, and that the movie was needlessly gruesome, in the way Monster Hunter games are not. For example, the venom-coated arrow goes straight into Diablos' eye with a sickening squelch. He and his daughter just did not have a good time at all. But what do I think about the movie and the discourse surrounding it? Like Gaijin Hunter, I too was cautiously optimistic for this movie. Yes, everyone said Paul Anderson's movie sucked, and yeah, the military aspect seemed a bit stupid, but even back then, it was obvious these characters were not going to last. You could tell from the trailers because they were absent from a lot of scenes that were clearly later in the movie. I regret not being able to find this for the video, but I recall a social media post from someone working on the movie, and this was after all the reactions had come out. To paraphrase, they said, "Guys, I know you are all angry and worried at how the movie is turning out. We're doing the best we can with a conservative budget. This isn't Marvel or Star Wars. We'd love to be able to remake the entire new world on the big screen, but that amount of work isn't possible." They were essentially just, begging people to give it a chance. And 18-year-old me thought that was very fair. I hadn't considered the budgets for these movies. Maybe if they had 300 million like Star Wars, they could recreate the Elder's Recess or Ancient Forest. But yeah, maybe they are doing the best with what they have. But when Gaijin Hunter hated the movie, that kind of eliminated any desire I had to see it. Gaijin was probably the only person on the planet who was positive towards the movie. If he hated it, then in my eyes, it probably wasn't worth seeing after all. So I ended up seeing the movie in 2025 for the first time. I knew Monster Hunter fans hated it. I knew they had issues with the military, Nursilla, Diablos, Gormagala being sequel bait, and everything else, but I tried to keep my mind open. What's interesting is that Anderson aims his franchise films for two kinds of people, those who are new to the universe and existing fans. For Mortal Kombat and Resident Evil, I was in the first camp and I enjoyed those movies, but I am a fan of Monster Hunter, so now the shoe was on the other foot, and after seeing it, I can confidently say that the movie isn't terrible. It's not good, but I do think all those replies were being a bit silly. There were quite a few things I liked, and a lot of problems too. We'll go beat by beat. I didn't find myself caring about the UN Army soldiers. The jokes that remained in the movie were bad too, and the dialogue was very cliché. One of them literally says, "This is way beyond my pay grade" at one point. When they get caught up in a sandstorm, they all start praying or kissing pictures of their families, and why am I supposed to care right now, The effects of the sandstorm were pretty cool though. I kind of liked how, despite the bizarreness of their situation, they gave themselves a goal and stuck to it. It shows they trusted Artemis as a leader, and she knew how to keep her cool, even when things got tough. I like how Rathalos is teased very early on as a threat, with the remains of Bravo team being burnt and the sand being turned to glass. Before encountering the Darren Moran skeleton, which is cool by the way, they spend a good minute singing this military song, and it feels like it lasts forever. I mean, again, it shows that, they're not just comrades but friends, but I don't need it. The Diablos ambush doesn't happen too long after this, but I wish the song was the direct cause, like, they just get interrupted with her arrival. It would make sense too, because Artemis uses that song to bait out Nursilla later on. Speaking of Diablos, or Black Diablos I suppose, I believe the movie did a really good job of showing how dangerous a monster can be to those who are unprepared to face one, which is an aspect I don't believe Monster Hunter games conveyed that well until Wilds. That game is really willing to put NPCs in direct danger from monsters, and I realised that all this time I've been taking my weapons and my skills for granted in a way, because realistically, what would the average person do against a Jarakan or Rompopolo, let alone the Black Flame? And this is something the movie does fantastically. Diablos' ambush knocks over the vehicle Steel and Axe are in, causing the former to be pinned underneath. Axe is able to free him, but Diablos knocks away the vehicle with such strength that it kills him on impact. Just an aside, Diablos is shown swimming through the sand slightly submerged. Monster Hunter fans criticise this because it's not something Diablos really does in the games, but I personally would not mind if they made it so he did it in his next appearance. It's really intimidating, like a miniature sandstorm is approaching. If they could replicate that effect on next-gen hardware, it could be something really cool. In the Nasilla cave, they all start freaking out, and I couldn't help but notice that there were 4 of them remaining. And even though I knew only Artemis was going to survive, at that point it occurred to me that I wouldn't really be fussed if they became a full Monster Hunter party of some kind. Of course that didn't really happen, but it could have. The Nasilla scene was creepy. Regarding perceived inaccuracies, I have more to say about that later. I like how Artemis finally crashes out when all of her crew are dead, and it is really creepy how the spiders were all just waiting for her in the cave. At this point, I was okay with the movie. Weak starts, but things were actually happening now. I had this issue with Mortal Kombat as well. However, we then got to the bit where Hunter and Artemis finally met. I do not know why they started fighting, or why neither of them de-escalated. The Hunter was helping Artemis and her friends and she knew that, and he knew she was part of the crew that got attacked. Yet they get into this really brutal fight that ends in him taking her prisoner, and then taunting her over how badly she needs water. At one point he starts praying, for his dead wife and child, represented by these 2 figures, and when Artemis turns the tables and imprisons him, she wrecks them on purpose, and it's like, so insanely mean? Why are they doing this? This is something Gaijin Hunter criticised all those years ago, and I really see what he meant. It makes them so unlikable, but it's baffling why they're fighting to begin with. Another thing is that the fight scenes have a distracting amount of cuts. The fight choreography is good, and it's worth remembering Tony Jaa is a trained martial artist, and Mila Jovovich has had plenty of fight training over the years for her movies. It's not like the cuts are trying to cover up a lack of talent, so why are there so many? And I think back to Mortal Kombat, where the fight scenes were shot in a far cleaner manner than they are here. Did Anderson regress as a filmmaker? I mentioned how that one reviewer highlighted the reports between Jaa and Jovovich as a strong point of the movie. I agree with them because after they finally make up, they're quite fun to watch together, despite the language barrier between the characters, or maybe that adds to it in some ways. There's even a couple of running gags that come up a few times, the first being chocolate, where Artemis offers some to the Hunter and he really enjoys it and then gets so disappointed that she doesn't have any more. He ends up using the word chocolate to refer to anything he thinks Artemis might find tasty. Another is that Artemis uses herself as bait to lure out the Nasilla, which almost gets her killed. She then angrily yells at the Hunter that next time, he'll be bait, and true to his word, during the Diablos battle he does do that, and even yells it. It also crops up again later where you'd least expect it, and it leads to some actual funny moments. Jaa's facial expressions are fantastic too, and I do think Jovovich is quite entertaining when Artemis' guard is down and she's trying to befriend the Hunter. Their partnership leads to the Diablos hunt being the best part of the movie. To me, the logic works well. We need to get to that tower, but we have to take care of Diablos first. We can put him to sleep using the Scylla Venom, so we're gonna have to kill that one first. And then the actual planning and training sequence was pretty well done too. During the fights, they're running from Diablos, and she's tracking them because she can sense their footsteps. And then they stop running, only for Diablos to go right past them. Have you ever seen the Undul fight in Stardust Crusaders? How he couldn't sense Jotaro and the others because they weren't moving? It's similar to that. The Hunter and Artemis become functionally invisible to Diablos when he remains still, which is something that does not happen in the games. But again, I would kind of welcome it, and I do think it's cool how they exploit this ability Diablos has. Before the hunt, they catapult a barrel or something to their desired location to lure Diablos in, knowing that she'll sense it from underground, just taking advantage of her abilities. Although like all plans in movies, this one goes wrong. The Hunter fires an arrow into Diablos' eye, and nothing happens. She sways a bit but keeps fighting. I don't understand why it didn't work. The movie doesn't really make it clear, I think. Diablos performs one of her iconic tail attacks, and it hits the Hunter the first time, but the second time he dodges, which is cool and is kind of how you'd experience Monster Hunter, learning attacks. Artemis killing the Diablos is a good scene too, The way she flails about is similar to when monsters are mounted in games like 4 or Generations. I think this sequence is where the movie peaks, and it's all downhill from here. Artemis carries the hunter through the desert and at one point has to save his life. However, when he finally wakes up, he acts all standoffish again, which is like, why are we doing this? Again? We should be past this by now. It's great once they reach the oasis though, because, finally some new environments and some colour, and the bit where the hunter uses Artemis as bait again is quite funny. Again, Zhao's facial expressions are great. That being said, the action sequence after this is really weird. To keep the Apsaros hauled away, both the Admiral and Artemis begin spinning and swinging their weapons around, which wards them off, and they keep spinning. The music is really dramatic, and it's just such a nothing scene. Speaking of music, it's not great. At the very least it's generic and unmemorable, and unlike Mortal Kombat, you're not really going to hear any music from the games here, which is a shame, because the music is something I really like in Monster Hunter. When she wakes up in her cell, the handler, Leah and Aiden are all kind of like staring at her like she's a zoo animal and mocking her. It has to be said again, why are they so mean? Artemis is the audience stand-in, and they're treating her this way. Why would I care about these people and what they want? The Admiral says he imprisoned her because the danger her world posed, which, fine, but there's no need to be sadistic about it. I will say it's nice that the cooking sequence with the Meowsila chef is identical to Monster Hunter World. He does look alright in this movie. The lore dump from the Admiral elaborates things like what's up with the tower and the potential history behind it all. What I couldn't help but notice is what he says about Rathalos.
Their only weakness is just before they breathe fire.
He's weakest when he's about to breathe fire. They travel through some different environments in a brief montage, and I couldn't help but wonder, if we spent less time with the military in the deserts, there might have been time to fight a monster in the volcano area. The Rathalos battle is not great. He's kind of big, and so it's hard to keep track of the action. He looks great, sounds like himself, and is very imposing. But as a fight, it's just a whole load of nothing. What I will say is, the sequence when Artemis returns to our world was nicely done. She wakes up, the UN army finds her, and they begin evacuating, and it's really well done because you see large shadows above her face and think Rathalos has followed her through. No, it's a plane. Is it? No, it's the helicopter propellers. So when Rathalos comes charging through the portal, it's a bit of a surprise and the whole sequence rules. Rathalos just ripping up military vehicles and killing soldiers. I really enjoyed it. This is the real advantage of having a Monster Hunter real-world isekai. It means Rathalos can do this. The reason I drew attention to Rathalos having an explicitly named weakness earlier is that I find it quite bad from a writing standpoint. Diablos had the ability to sense movement on the ground while burrowing. Even the smallest rock would cause it to erupt and look for intruders. And the movie demonstrates this, and the hunters figure this out and were able to exploit it a few times. It's never really elaborated on either, it's just something the audience should figure out on their own, and it makes that whole bit quite engaging. So to go from that to Rathalos is weak when he's about to breathe fire is not nearly as good, especially because it gets repeated numerous times.
Remember, they're weak just before they breathe fire.
Even in a brief flashback, as if they're trying to drill it into our heads.
A Rathalos.
It just felt like Anderson couldn't figure out a compelling way to take down Rathalos. But even if you're going to stick to some basic fantasy dragon weakness, why not let Artemis figure it out herself, showing that she's really learnt a lot from her journey to the new world? It just kind of sucks. I will say, part of me got excited when the hunter showed up to deal the final blow. He has explosive arrows and lights fuses on them, and you can see them burn up in real time. It looks really cool. Unfortunately, my excitement promptly deflated when the rest of the movie happened. Gormagala shows up, the characters proclaim that they need to shut the tower down and rush him, and then the movie ends? Going in, I knew a fair bit about this movie, including that Gormagala was just sequel bait. And that's not necessarily an issue. For better or worse, video game movies have had a long history of ending like that, where a new adventure is about to begin, even Mortal Kombat or Super Mario Bros. What I did not expect was the movie just not having an ending. What the hell was that? The third act was about shutting down the Sky Tower, and they don't even do it. It's ridiculous. Based on how everything else went, I do think Anderson kind of just gave up with the third act. It's so much worse paced than everything before it. I watched this movie before shopping Mortal Kombat or the Resident Evils, and so I didn't know what to expect from an Anderson movie, but I can confidently say that I was having a good time up until Diablos died, and then the movie just falls off a cliff and it gets so weird and boring. The hunter and Artemis' friendship, which was really endearing in the second act, it doesn't get any more moments until Rathalos is dead. Some aspects are underdeveloped. The hunter, with limited language, explains to Artemis that his family died, and that a Rathalos was responsible. This does not get mentioned again for the rest of the movie, but it is probably why he deals the final blow. Mila Jovovich's character is named Natalie Artemis. This was known from promotional materials, interviews and more, but it's not actually said in the movie until after she comes back to our world, and the military guys read her tags. That's a really bizarre amount of time for us to learn our protagonist's name. Artemis herself is also kind of a nothing character. She's a tough military woman who kind of just does things, but there's very little to latch onto aside from the horror of her situation, which I guess works considering she's an audience stand-in. Throughout the movie, she's shown clutching a ring that's evidently important to her, but it's never explained what it means. The hunter doesn't have much to him either. What they have is that they're entertaining together, and that is the best part of the movie, but also a small part. It also just occurred to me, they never explain why bullets don't work. This is the core premise of the movie, that the military is in the Monster Hunter world and their modern weapons don't work, but they don't explain why at all. Stila drops grenades onto Diablos, and later her horn shatters in a seemingly unrelated incident. So maybe those are related, but Artemis hits her point blank with an RPG later, and nothing really happens. The movie is bad. It's not terrible, but I definitely would not call it good, and I absolutely enjoyed the other movies by Anderson more. I think what Monster Hunter lacks compared to them is that they're fun, while Monster Hunter is just boring for a good chunk of it. I think about all the cool locations and fight scenes in Mortal Kombat, and the various stages of the Hive in Resident Evil, but Monster Hunter is mostly just desert. In interviews, Anderson constantly talks up, the beautiful landscapes they filmed, and I don't know, maybe this stuff was prettier in person, but I just don't see it. It's just a desert. And it's actually refreshing when we finally get new colours in the Oasis. In various interviews, Anderson was very adamant that he had made Monster Hunter to be a one and done. We always take it one movie at a time, he said. This is contrary to what he has said in the past, where he reckoned Monster Hunter could become a whole cinematic universe because of how diverse its setting is. But I want to focus on that Deadline interview from 2016. At the time, the movie was starting pre-production of sorts. Anderson and Bolt very much say they had 2 movies planned at that moment. The first would end with monsters crossing over into our world. The second would deal with the outcome of that. Granted, this was back when the protagonist would have been an ordinary guy in an ordinary job, way before the military got involved. But based on how the actual movie ends, Anderson either had another one planned or believed a sequel was guaranteed. Mila Jovovich even said that he was writing one, and while that might seem short-sighted, he did get 5 Resident Evil sequels. Things just didn't work out this time. Despite me going in with an open mind, I did not enjoy the movie overall. I rewatched it after seeing Anderson's other movies, and I still didn't vibe with it. It's bad in a way Resident Evil or Mortal Kombat somehow weren't. There's something critical missing here. Before we move on, I want to say that I don't think the negative critical reception was wholly responsible for it flopping, but I mostly think what happened with the Chinese release was the main cause. Anderson's other movies reviewed worse, yet were still massive successes, so I can only assume Monster Hunter fans hating it didn't really play a big role in its flopping. That being said, it's still important to talk about what fans thought of the movie, because that is what has defined its legacy. In this chapter of the video, I want to discuss the discourse surrounding the Monster Hunter movie, Anderson, the portrayal of various different things, and what people have said about all this over the years. One of the most prominent worries pre-release and criticisms post-release was that Anderson wasn't someone who had played the games, and was just making the movie because it's an easy IP to take and make some slop from. This kind of accusation was perhaps warranted, because that's how a lot of video game adaptations can go. Writers or directors will not play the games and merely take the names of characters and locations and make something entirely different. An example is the Tekken movie, which did not feature any of the supernatural elements of those games and was made without consulting Tekken's creators. Perhaps you've heard the phrase, disrespecting the source material. The writing team for the Witcher series was accused of doing this, ignoring the books, and that was blamed for why the later seasons of the show allegedly turned out bad. I haven't seen it. There's plenty of others over the years, even as far back as the original Super Mario Bros. Movie, which, Before the Monster Hunter movie was released, people accused Anderson of doing this. In one interview, he described how fantastic Monster Hunter's setting was by describing the Darren Moran sequence in 4 Ultimate. People interpreted this as him having only played that mission and deciding to make a movie from it, and this attitude only intensified afterwards, due to perceived inaccuracies. Nasilla, for example, doesn't look much like how he does in the games, and his behaviour is totally different too. Where was it shown that he hates sunlight? Where was he shown having smaller baby versions? The movie takes place in a new world, so why are Nasilla and Gore Magala here? They were not in Monster Hunter World. And what kind of fan would include the military in Monster Hunter? Very recently, it was announced that the upcoming God of War show would be written by Ronald D. Moore, who in an interview admitted he hadn't played any of the games.
Oh, right now I'm working on an adaptation of, there's a video game called God of War. Yeah, and I'm not a gamer, so it's even more like, okay, I've never done this before.
Do you try to play the game?
I've tried. I'm not a gamer. You know, I've taken a stab at it, but I don't have. But the controllers now, it's like
No, they have like buttons here and like
press R1. Which one's R1? Oh, I'm dead.
Because he's on the older side and couldn't really figure it out. This led to mass outrage by gamers. Another video game adaptation by someone who hasn't played it? This means it's going to be awful. I disagree actually. Ronald D. Moore is an award-winning writer who's written hundreds of episodes of television in the past. He's good at his job. The truth is, being a fan doesn't really matter a whole lot when it comes to how adaptations turn out. Sometimes things that don't respect the source material can turn out for the better. For example, Paul Verhoeven adapted a book called Starship Troopers into a highly regarded movie. Thing is, he didn't even finish the book. He read a few chapters, got bored and put it down. Blatant disrespect for the source material, but he still turned out a good movie. Ronald D. Moore would not have to go that far, he could just watch a playthrough, have access to the game's script, creators, and more. I'm a recovering Star Wars fan. When the sequel trilogy came out, some people hated them and believed that the writers hated Star Wars and were trying to destroy it, when in reality, they were fans who just made some critical mistakes. You also think back to George Lucas, who created the source material and still managed to make some bad movies too. But then you have Tony Gilroy, who infamously does not really care about Star Wars.
In fact, that was my superpower. I don't like I just never been interested in Star Wars ever.
He's the showrunner for Andor, which might be the best Star War since 1980. He's not that interested in the source material, the Clone Wars or whatever, but he's a history nerd who studied revolutions and believed he could tell an interesting Star Wars story with that framework. And he didn't do it alone. He had a team of fantastic writers, cinematographers, actors, the casting director, funding. There's always more factors behind these things than you would expect. The truth is, being a fan does not really play a massive role in terms of how an adaptation will play out. What matters is, are you a competent writer, director? Have you employed highly skilled staff? Do you have enough funding? And sometimes even that's not enough. Even before World, Monster Hunter was one of Capcom's top earners. The games were selling really well. They would not have just handed it to someone who didn't care. Based on everything I've seen from him, in interviews and the movie itself, Anderson is a Monster Hunter fan. Does that matter? No, not really, because the movie is still bad. Anderson secured the rights to an adaptation before even Monster Hunter 4 was out. I believe him when he said he started the games in 2008, which would be around the time Freedom Unite was out. He says he loves Diablos. He noted in interviews that this was actually a black Diablos in the movie, and even mentioned that little factoid that it's a female Diablos in Heat. I think there is a reason that Diablos loses the horn and is later faced as a one-horned Diablos. During production, he went further than he'd gone with all his previous productions, and actually travelled to quote-unquote the middle of nowhere to shoot the movie in a real natural place, because he felt like it was the only way to do a Monster Hunter movie justice. Yeah, sure, it resulted in the movie being mostly desert, but you don't do all that if you're trying to be lazy. The reason they went with an isekai was to capture the feeling of a newcomer playing a Monster Hunter game, where everything is new to you, and all those monsters look so imposing. I can't lie, I've always wanted to have that feeling again. He pointed out that in Monster Hunter, you largely make your own character, and they don't really have a personality of sorts. He was right. This was long before Wilds, so Artemis might have made sense from that standpoint. It's not even just Anderson. Mila Jovovich also played the games for the movie. The reason Artemis uses dual swords is because she vibed with the weapon while playing, and thought it would look good on the big screen. I also wouldn't be shocked if she chose them, because that's what Alice wielded in the third Resident Evil movie. There's a scene where Artemis accidentally activates demon mode, and it takes her by surprise. Jovovich actually insisted to her husband that it was necessary to include demon mode in the movie, because she knew how important it was to the weapon in the games. In interviews, she has also highlighted an aspect of Monster Hunter that many of us fans like too. The monsters are part of the natural world here. Diablos in the movie is not particularly malicious. She's just protecting her territory from intruders, and needs to be defeated so the hunters can pass safely. Jovovich pointed out that in Monster Hunter, you defeat these monsters not for the sake of it, but to craft weapons, get food, armor, and that's what separates Monster Hunter from other settings. Like, it's safe to say Anderson is obviously a fan, as are a lot of the staff that worked on this movie. I think that line of criticism is very silly and a waste of time. What's even more interesting is that he himself has highlighted the importance of playing the games you're adapting into movies, and has criticised writers who don't do that. He talked about how he and his crew on the Resident Evil movies played the games, and really enjoyed them, If you look at video game adaptations, quite often that isn't true. You see filmmakers giving interviews saying I never played the game. It is very disrespectful to the IP. How can you adapt something without understanding the original IP? You'd never dream of adapting a book without reading it. Somehow, people feel with video games it's okay to just kind of jump in there without really understanding its DNA. He also emphasised the importance of not just appealing to the casual audience, but Monster Hunter fans. I really don't think he made this movie with the intention of angering fans. Things just ended up that way because the movie isn't good. But regardless of the movie's quality, there is an interesting question. Anderson has played Monster Hunter, undoubtedly, but does he actually understand Monster Hunter's DNA? Earlier I said that unlike Anderson's other franchise films where I approached them as a general audience member with no familiarity with Mortal Kombat or Resident Evil, I watched Monster Hunter as a Monster Hunter fan, and I noticed a lot of things that kind of just reinforced that someone who gets Monster Hunter made the movie. There's around 6 soldiers that get transported through the portal, and I couldn't help but notice that there's a shot that emphasises 5 of them walking together when they're investigating what remains of Bravo Team. Monster Hunter sickos will remember that the reason hunts are limited to 4 people is because once upon a time, 5 went to hunt a Lao Shenlong and 1 died. So hunting with more than 4 people is seen as bad luck. Case in point, the entire party wipes to Diablos and Nasilla. There's other examples too. Artemis is treated like she's dead when Nasilla stings her, and a normal audience member would assume so too, but a Monster Hunter fan would know that this only really puts you to sleep in the games. I do like how Artemis waking up and being in pain and all groggy leads to a plot twist where you assume the same thing has happened to Link, only to get the horrifying reveal that something far worse has happened to him. Nasilla laying eggs in living things isn't established as something that can happen in the games either, so this was a twist for everyone, Monster Hunter fans and the general audience alike, which is something Anderson has said is important to include in video game movies. Black Diablos is featured in a lot of the movie's marketing, and is on many of the movie's posters. You could argue she is the flagship of the Monster Hunter movie. Unlike most flagships, the movie has the protagonist encounter the monster early on, in a situation she cannot win, only for her to finally take Diablos down later. They even have Artemis prepare for the fight by making new gear. Many fans will have done this in the games too, taking down a monster because its armor or weapon has some special property that's highly effective against a tougher monster. That's the whole loop of the games. Even the language barrier between the hunter and Artemis. A lot of the older games didn't really give you an easy way to freely communicate during a hunt, and if they did, you'd sometimes find yourself with someone who didn't speak the same language as you. But that wasn't a big deal at all. You'd still be on the same page and would understand what to do and when. So in some ways, it's cool how the movie also has that going on. And ultimately, you have to be a real Monster Hunter sicko to put the ancient civilization in your movie in any capacity. The movie was undeniably made by a Monster Hunter fan, but that largely doesn't matter either way. Fans can make bad adaptations, and non-fans can make great ones. The Monster Hunter movie is bad because the story sucks, the characters are not interesting, and are weirdly aggressive towards each other for no reason, in a way that makes them unlikable. The third act is rushed, and the movie doesn't even have an ending. That one's probably my biggest issue because honestly, I thought the movie was bad but enjoyable in a way similar to Anderson's other movies until after Diablos died, because it feels like he just gave up from there. If the third act was solid, the movie might have been good in the same way Resident Evil was, but it's not. When I look at the things people say about this movie, both at release and to this day, I think that general audiences believe the movie is bad and boring, maybe enjoyable if you turn your brain off. It actually has a positive score on Rotten Tomatoes, which is not the case for any of the Resident Evil movies. Monster Hunter fans, however, treat the movie as an insult to life itself. I think it's safe to say they never really had high hopes for this thing, and arguably were predisposed against it. You could confidently blame the military's involvement in my opinion. People are not necessarily against isekais. The Sonic the Hedgehog movies are isekais, and are largely very popular. I myself enjoyed the third one, but some question if it was necessary for Monster Hunter. And the combination of having UN army soldiers just made them angry. I wrote US in the script, damn it. Fans wanted to see real hunters with real armor and weapons in the movie, not soldiers with guns. Whenever discussion of the movie comes up, this is primarily what angers people. The army does not belong in Monster Hunter. But that might be why Anderson put them there. He said he included the soldiers because he thought it would be interesting to have modern day warriors being transported to a world where their weapons and techniques have little to no effect on the threats that exist there, and then would have to be taught by the warriors of this world how to live and get by. And as he said in interviews, guns against monsters isn't something alien to the series, as Rathalos, Tigrex, and a monster-fied Metal Gear Rex appeared in Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker as part of a collaboration. Big Boss and friends had to use their guns and RPGs to take the monsters down, and Anderson said he was inspired by this for the movie. It's also worth mentioning the US military lets filmmakers use equipment free of charge, provided they get to review the script, and this is rather common among Hollywood productions, like the MCU for instance. I've seen plenty of fans say Anderson included soldiers because he never played Monster Hunter and didn't know the real life military aren't in the games, and even though I myself don't like this either, I do want to push back on that notion. I said people were predisposed against the movie because of the isekai aspect combined with the soldiers. I think many people had criticisms of the movie based on the trailers, and then they didn't see the movie but kept on repeating those criticisms. One of the most prominent talking points I see is, the military shouldn't be able to beat a monster, or why are the military needed to fight a Rathalos? I preemptively teased this video on my channel page, and no disrespect to this person, but somebody said, if anybody thinks the US military can beat all Monster Hunter monsters, then they're dumb and wrong. This is interesting, because it's the main thing people say when they're talking about how bad Monster Hunter is as a movie, but the criticism implies that the story is about the military taking on and beating different monsters, when really it's just Artemis because the soldiers don't even survive the first act, and the movie makes a point to show that guns don't work. It does not explain why, which is a problem, but that doesn't change the fact that after the introduction, the soldiers do not play a huge role in the movie, but based on how people talk about it, you would assume they take down Rathalos with fighter planes, which is the opposite of what happens, literally. Some of the criticisms are very silly too. At one point, the Admiral is explaining to Artemis what a Rathalos is, and he says, they're almost impossible to kill. And people go, wow, this idiot Anderson doesn't even know that Rathalos is a mid-game threat. And it's like, guys, come on, like, Rathalos is the movie's final boss. They're going to hype him up for the audience who doesn't know what he is, it's not a big deal. Some people get upset because the Great Sword isn't big enough, which, it's a prop that the actors have to physically swing around and do stunts with. Ron Perlman was 68 during filming, and was horrified at the size of the axe he had to wield, and that was before they set it on fire. It's fine, you know? People were angry that Artemis used fire swords to face Rathalos, when the fire effect is just demon mode. Could it have been more red? Yeah, probably, but it's the kind of thing you wouldn't complain about if you'd seen the movie. There's also a weird complaint that Diablos is portrayed as a carnivore. As far as I can tell, the movie doesn't even say or imply that. Some of the complaints do make more sense. In Monster Hunter games you see villages, people, felines. This doesn't really show up in the movie at all, which is disappointing. And in the games you see a lot of different monsters. Here you see 4, and 1 is barely present. I do agree with people who are disappointed at this, but I also think you have to take the movie's budget into consideration. $60 million is not so much, and CGI is expensive. I think Diablos, Rathalos, Apsaros, and a countless Nasilla do look pretty good, and it's better that the budget went there. The lack of villages is a shame, but part of me appreciates the lack of civilization seen in the movie. It establishes that Nasilla come out at night, and so the Hunter and Artemis have to sleep in a reinforced shipwreck that shakes as the Nasilla crawl all over it, en masse. Similar to Monster Hunter Wilds, which came out 5 years later, it made me appreciate how dangerous the world can be. The villages in Monster Hunter are largely based in locations that aren't often in this much danger, and I think it's very telling that the one civilization we do see was long destroyed. Of course, there's their prominent criticism of inaccuracies. Nasilla looks nothing like how he does in the games, exhibiting behaviour that's not seen there either. That's also the case with Diablos. We see a Darren Moran skeleton, but he nor Gormagala were ever seen in the New World, nor is the ancient civilization there. Lots of weird things that make it clear Anderson never played the games, which, you know, isn't the case. And there are reasons for all of this. With Resident Evil, Anderson had full creative control, but he still regularly consulted with Capcom on everything, and that's why they were happy to give him Monster Hunter. But with this movie, they were more involved than before, and Anderson implied that this time, they did in fact have the final say on a lot of things. They reviewed the script, discussed with Anderson what kind of monsters and locations would be in the movie. They reviewed the props and the costumes too. So when people talk about the size of the Great Sword in the movie, Capcom approved that. And unfortunately for poor Ron Perlman, they did request that the switch axe he wielded should be bigger than it would have been. And when I say Capcom, I should be clear that I mean series producer Ryozo Sugimoto and prominent director Konami Fujioka. They are credited as associate producers on the movie. Everything was run by them, and they gave their inputs on everything. One example Anderson gave involved the creation of Diablos for the movie. Initially, Anderson's team gave Diablos pointed toes, but Fujioka said no, they should be round and blunt, because Diablos burrows through the sand. That's something Anderson was forced to change, to be more accurate to who the monster is. It got to the point where Anderson was flying to Japan rather often to discuss the movie with Capcom's animation staff, so they could give input on how the monsters moved. Fujioka even helped Anderson figure out where in the Monster Hunter world the movie took place, which is somewhere near the Wildspire Waste. Aiden appears in the movie, and what's amusing is that up until the casting announcement, we didn't actually know the character's name, even in the games. It was revealed for the movie before the Vitalis assignment in Iceborne released, which is where we formally learned his name. Basically everything about this movie was run by Sujimoto, Fujioka, and so many others at Capcom. This is word of God stuff. Take Nasilla, whose portrayal basically every Monster Hunter fan has criticised. Nasilla is like this because Fujioka and co gave Anderson the thumbs up. This portrayal isn't really inaccurate to the lore, because it was approved and shaped by the ones who made and actively still create the lore. And truth be told, even upon the movie's release, you could argue this portrayal of Nasilla fits pretty cleanly into what we knew of him in Monster Hunter 4. Nasilla is implied to be born in the desert, before migrating elsewhere, and is usually found in cooler regions like the Sunken Hollow. In fact, shrouded Nasilla can be found in the dunes, but only at night. It is impossible to find him there during the day, so the idea that he hates the bright desert sun works with that quite well. There's the matter of his design being altered, but you could argue that's simply a younger, immature form of Nasilla, which works when you remember the hatchlings. Monster Hunter 4 never showed how Nasilla lays eggs, so from that standpoint, this movie gave new information on the monster, instead of contradicting anything, and you can even see people pointing this out in discussion at the time of the movie's release. Fact of the matter is, it's very hard to say that this movie goes against Monster Hunter because of Fujioka and Sujimoto's involvement. The Admiral uses his switch axe as if it's a charged blade, with an AED and everything. People hated that, but if it's in the movie then it was approved by Capcom. Everything about Diablos, Rathalos, the characters, props, Gore Magala, the ancient civilization, all of this being in the new world, the portals, everything was approved by the very creators of the series we know today. Can you really call these portrayals disrespectful to the source material if that's the case? Some of you might be wondering, why did I watch the Monster Hunter movie in 2025, after skipping it back when it released? What got me interested after so long? It's simple. Nasilla. When he was announced for Wilds, people quickly noticed that he had some subtle design changes, namely, an increase in poison spikes and a different leg structure, and funnily enough, this now meant he looked very similar to the movie version. We've seen movie synergy with prominent video games. For example, the visual style of Mario Wonder was influenced by how expressive the movie was, and I recall Princess Peach being subtly changed in the box art of her new game to make her more similar to the movie version, and now this was happening with Monster Hunter. People criticised Nasilla having dozens of little hatchlings as something from a horror movie, as if it didn't belong in Monster Hunter, but now in Wilds, he has hatchlings that do the same. In Wilds, you find the remains of an old civilization that had monsters serving and protecting them, and that includes Rathalos. Gore Magala is present too. We're seeing a lot of similarities already, but it goes further. It's important to remember that Wilds started development in 2019, which is when the Monster Hunter movie was in post-production. The Nasilla redesign got me interested in watching the movie, because I initially dismissed it just like everyone else, as a movie that came out and failed. But the truth is, ideas that Capcom had for Wilds may have shown up in the movie first. For example, the storm that overtook the soldiers at the beginning reminded me very much of the sand tide in the Windward Plains, with blue lightning and everything. We see the use of weapon switching in the movie, with Tony Jaa wielding both a bow and a greatsword, and this is a mechanic that appeared in Wilds. The special Rathalos that guards the ruins of an ancient civilization? Check. The idea of having a special weak point as they're about to attack? Also check. It's interesting because, judging by the monsters present in the movie, it's clearly started development around the time of Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate. At the very least, that's the game Anderson felt closest to when designing the movie, as he's publicly praised the Darren Moran sequence and compared it to Dune, and both Darren and Gore Magala show up. But the movie started going when Monster Hunter World was out. It ends up being based more around that game, set in a new world with characters from World 2. But somehow you can argue that it's also linked to Wilds. I wouldn't be shocked if Capcom were also expecting the movie to do well as Resident Evil, get more sequels, and as such, while Resident Evil went a bit off the rails, it's possible they wanted future Monster Hunter movies to have far better continuity with the actual games. Speaking of, in early 2021, Monster Hunter World added a special assignment, a collaboration with the Monster Hunter movie. You played as Artemis and fought a Black Diablos and a giant Rathalos. Mila Jovovich was actually scanned, and recorded voice lines for this quest too, and you would be rewarded with her armor from the movie. Sadly, you can no longer play this quest because it was removed from the game, likely due to licenses expiring. What's very interesting is that this quest takes place after the movie, at an undisclosed point in Monster Hunter World. Artemis refers to being back, and recognises the Admiral, comments on the Apsaros being much more friendly than her time in the movie, and says, "You again?" when seeing Black Diablos. There are a lot of funny details. If you fire a screamer pod and cause Black Diablos to be forced out of the ground, Artemis realizes that it's weak to loud noises, which of course is something she never learned in the movie. After defeating the Black Diablos, the Admiral shows up, but he's speaking the Monster Hunter language and doesn't recognize Artemis at all. Suddenly, an oversized Rathalos shows up, and they head to the ancient forest to face him. Artemis recognizes it as the Rathalos from the movie, and is confused as to why it's back. She's also confused as to why the Admiral doesn't know English. She soon figures out she's accidentally travelled to the past, before she had ever shown up in this world. The giant Rathalos basically only uses grounded attacks, which makes him strangely harder than he normally is because of his massive size. Maybe flying would have caused too many issues with the wider forest. Artemis eventually defeats the Rathalos, but it decides to leave. The storm from the movie shows up too, and so she decides to go home. She hands a dictionary to the Admiral and tells him to be nicer next time, even referencing a line he says in the movie. As the Admiral is wondering what just happened, his Palico shows up and suggests going home to avoid the storm and eat some food. The Admiral agrees and forgets where he even got the dictionary from, but keeps it with him. So, this quest is canon to the movie. It explains why the Admiral knows English when nobody else does, and why they were investigating the tower to begin with, looking for the giant's Rathalos. But the movie might be canon to the game too. In the arts book, Dive into Iceborne, they finally talked about Fatalis and gave actual lore on the infamous dragon, not the rubbish you'd find on the fandom wiki. One of the more interesting things it says is that Fatalis has no Elder Dragon blood in his veins, which sets him apart from other Elder Dragons who do all have it. It's also speculated that he came from a different dimension, through a portal of some kind. They back this theory by referencing a traveller who came through a portal into the desert, and that it's possible something similar could have happened with Fatalis in Castle Shrade. This is the only theory of origin they present for Fatalis. The traveller they're talking about is Artemis. They're directly talking about her in a section of the art book she has little to do with. This means that for better or worse, the Monster Hunter movie quest is canon to the games. Take that to its natural conclusion, the movie is canon as well. There's no reason to even mention Artemis otherwise. The Fatalis portals thing is... we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, but the only reason they'd ever mention this as a theory to begin with is because it's an idea they want us to keep in mind. As such, I would take it much more seriously than others would. Back to Artemis and the movie though, it's clear she survived her fight with Gore Magala. What exactly happened afterwards? Why she felt the need to come back to the world? There's no answers and likely won't be, considering the movie bombed. But judging by the kinds of ideas that turned up in Wilds later, when you remember how closely Capcom worked with Anderson on the movie, it's possible sequels would have had more overt connections with the games. Either way, with Anderson being such a huge fan of the games, Sugimoto and Fujioka reviewing, rejecting, and approving everything about the movie, and it's having some very clear ties to the games, it's kind of undeniable that the movie isn't just respectful to the source material, it is source material to an extent. The movie isn't the first time people said something didn't belong in Monster Hunter, nor was it the last. In Monster Hunter Rise, Elder Dragons Ibushi and Nawa resonated with the Wyverian twins, causing them to repeat their thoughts. In Wilds, a long-dead civilization managed to make their own monsters that were immortal and totally obedient. People said these things didn't belong in Monster Hunter, but they're in. We are not really the arbiters of what does or doesn't belong in the games. If the very creators of Monster Hunter say dimensional portals and ex-UN army soldiers belong in Monster Hunter, are we really in a position to say otherwise? Regardless, that does not mean you have to like it. Konami Fujioka may be an associate producer on the movie, and it inherently has Monster Hunter DNA and is probably canon to the games. That doesn't mean you have to pretend it's good. Likewise, even though I myself like Nawa and Ibushi, it's okay for others to dislike the supernatural stuff with them, as well as Wyveria in Wilds. However, to an extent, it is something you have to accept, because regardless of whether you like them or not, they're canon and likely will be relevant later, and you don't want to be blindsided when things inevitably get weirder. It's been roughly 4 years since the worldwide release of the Monster Hunter movie. Paul W.S. Anderson has since moved on to other projects, and it's likely we won't see a sequel. If another movie is attempted, it will probably be unrelated to this one. Is this disappointing? Perhaps. The movie isn't good, and I do think Anderson has gotten a lot worse at filmmaking over time. But it's not awful, and I don't think it's an affront to everything sacred about Monster Hunter like a lot of fans would say. I believe a direct sequel would have been interesting at least, since Anderson clearly wrote the movie with the idea he would get one. Would we see Shigeru Magala? An actual Darren Moran battle? Fatalis? Either way, Monster Hunter gets bigger and bigger every day, so it's only a matter of time before we see another attempt at a movie. But Paul W.S. Anderson's Monster Hunter is not the only movie adaptation right now. Monster Hunter Legends of the Guild released several months after the movie. It's a somewhat short animated film that serves as a prequel to Monster Hunter 4 and World. It's more or less an Aiden origin story. Because it came out so close to the Anderson movie, the two were compared, with Legends getting heavily favoured, to the point many proclaim it as the true and only Monster Hunter movie. I saw it at the time of release, and while I thought it was decent, it was clearly low budget, and there was a feeling in the back of my mind that it was very lucky it released so close to the Anderson movie. I believe there's no better time to revisit it, so in the future I will be making a video discussing it more. Thank you for watching this video. It's not really like anything I've ever made before. I talk about Monster Hunter games, but never have I had to talk about a movie of all things, multiple even. This was initially only going to be a simple review of the Monster Hunter movie, but then I thought it would be better to expand it into a look at Paul W.S. Anderson, since so much discussion of the movie is centered around him. I can't see myself ever rebranding into a movie channel, but I did enjoy seeking out Shopping and Mortal Kombat. They're good movies. Fun fact, I even watched Tommy Wiseau's The Room because I needed to see what an actual awful movie looked like, and Monster Hunter isn't that. I would recommend watching it yourself and forming your own opinion, because many have found real enjoyment in it. I would really recommend going in with an open mind. Some of you might wonder why, despite talking extensively about Anderson and his career, I never mentioned his controversies. In particular, why didn't I discuss what happened to Olivia Jackson, who was Milla Jovovich's stunt double for Resident Evil, the final chapter? Due to alleged negligence from Anderson and the staff on set, she ended up suffering horrific injuries that ensured she would never work in this field ever again, and had to fight hard to be compensated as the production company refused to pay her, even though she wasn't at fault. Today she's doing okay, and has won a legal case against the company responsible for operating the camera during the scene, although she still suffers from those injuries, and her life will never be the same again. Earlier I brought up superfluous reasons why people didn't like Anderson, but this incident was not the first time someone was injured on one of his sets. People are more than justified in disliking him or preemptively dismissing his work over this. Some even boycotted the Monster Hunter movie at the time. It is legitimately a terrible look for Anderson, and even Capcom for continuing to work with him after this, and it should be discussed. To be completely honest, I wanted to bring it up earlier, and it's even in my notes for the video, but I couldn't figure out a good place, time, or even reason. I wasn't sure how I would introduce this topic, what broader points I'd make from it, or how I'd even follow up from it. This is not the kind of thing you can easily talk about before moving on to Big Rathalos or how the spider was portrayed wrong. Admittedly, I am not used to talking about serious topics on this channel at all. I talk about video games, but somebody suffered life-altering injuries. How do I approach that? Talking about what happened to Olivia Jackson earlier on in the video was just something I wasn't sure about at all. However, it cannot and should not be ignored, especially considering a huge chunk of the video is about Anderson, so I think it's best to at least mention it here. I hope you all understand, and I do recommend looking into this incident for yourself if you want to learn more. So, what do you all think of the Monster Hunter movie? Did you watch it on release, later, or have you not seen it at all? And what do you think of Legends of the Guild? Let me know in the comments. I do really like reading and responding to as many as possible. Remember to like and subscribe, and have a good day.